Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Home+Hired, brought to you by the Center for Employment Opportunities and the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, also known as MI-CEMI. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you've been having a wonderful day thus far and that it only gets better. My name is Daniel Jones, and I am the Outreach and Engagement Coordinator for MI-CEMI, and I will also be your moderator for today's panel. If at any time you have any questions for our panelists, please utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, and we will do our best to answer them. To get things going, I'd like to share a little bit with you about MI-CEMI and our work. So the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration is a broad-based, statewide, nonpartisan collaboration representing nonprofit, faith-based, advocacy, grassroots, and service organizations united to end mass incarceration in Michigan. MI-CEMI is dedicated to leveraging individual and organizational power through a coalition building framework to implement policy changes and reduce our prison and jail populations in this state. The collaborative also seeks to create and restore healthy communities. And if you'd like to know more about MI-CEMI and how you can join us and support our efforts, just stick around and I'll be sure to tell you about this a little later. Today's webinar is coordinated in partnership with MI-CEMI's Rejuvenating Reentry Working Group Co-Chair, Center for Employment Opportunities. At this time, I will turn it over to Leah Bacon, who will talk to you more about the Center for Employment Opportunities, provide an overview of today's webinar, and briefly introduce our panelists. Leah.
Thank you so much, Danny. Hi all, my name is Leah Bacon. I am the Senior Policy Associate providing support to CEO Michigan. The Center for Employment Opportunities, CEO, is the largest nonprofit reentry employment provider in the country. CEO provides immediate, effective, and comprehensive employment services exclusively to individuals who recently were released from incarceration and/or have prior justice involvement. CEO opened their Detroit office back in 2018 and have since provided services to over 300 returning citizens. And we are excited to expand our reach and continue providing services to more individuals in Oakland County with our new office, CEO Pontiac, that actually opened this week. Next slide, please. In a moment, I will briefly introduce our panelists for today's discussion. We're really excited to have everyone here. We have broken down the webinar into three main sections. The first one is understanding the problem and challenges returning citizens have as it relates to reentry generally, and then reentry employment opportunities specifically. Then we will break up our solutions into two different bucket areas, the first being practice level and the second being policy level. We will get to hear from experts in the field who have changed both their practices and policies around reentry employment and second chance hiring. And finally, we will leave some time for questions. Again, as Danny mentioned, throughout this webinar, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them throughout today's discussion. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so next I'm going to briefly introduce the different panelists. I'll start with our CEO folks. We have Conrad Cowell and Shanor Lewis, both alumni of CEO's Participant Advocacy Council, where they participated in various advocacy, organizing, and leadership programming and events, including welcoming Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib to our CEO Detroit office. Conrad recently completed CEO's Advocacy Fellowship and is part of the inaugural team for CEO Pontiac as the location's life skills educator and job coach. And Shanor is starting his new position on Monday as an information technology help desk support next week. Then we have Sarah Hinstork. Sarah is a senior associate on CEO's inclusive hiring team. This team partners with employers and workforce intermediaries to address barriers faced by talented job seekers with past convictions and provides an array of tools, guidance, and technical assistance offerings, such as reviewing human resource policies and coaching staff on implementing fair chance hiring practices. Next, we have Kaiser Fraser. Kaiser is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. Corporation for a Skilled Workforce is a national nonprofit organization that partners with government, business, education, and community leaders to connect workers with education and good jobs, increase the competitiveness of companies, and build sustainable communities. As a key member of CSW's leadership team, Kaisha leads the strategic development of high-impact strategies to increase economic mobility, particularly for people of color and others historically excluded from advancement opportunities. Jan Harrington Davis is the Vice President of Talent Acquisition and Workforce Diversity at Henry Ford Health Systems. She joined Henry Ford in 2007 and now oversees talent acquisition and workforce diversity initiatives for the organization. She has deployed a workforce development strategy to align diversity initiatives across the health system while removing barriers to employment and promotional opportunities, including those for returning citizens. And then finally, Dr. J.R. Sledge. Dr. Sledge is the Managing Director for Perscalis Detroit. Perscalis provides skills training and access to employer networks to individuals often excluded from tech careers. Since opening in 2019, Perscalis has trained over 200 people, including some individuals referred from CEO. Dr. Sledge has years of teaching and leadership experience serving in K-12 and post-secondary education. He has authored and co-authored over 25 peer-reviewed international and national articles and presentations in the areas of social justice, cultural competence, and teacher leadership. I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Danny, to begin facilitating today's conversation.
Thank you, Leah. And to start things off, I definitely would just like to share very briefly that as someone who is formerly incarcerated, I reached out to CEO inquiring whether or not there would be available job opportunities for me and if I could use this as my employment opportunity when filling out my parole eligibility report. CEO definitely responded to that inquiry, and I would just like to thank you personally because I was able to obtain my parole based on utilizing the letter that you all sent to me in regards to my employment opportunities. So thank you for your hard work and efforts. To begin this conversation with a brief overview of reentry hiring and employment landscape, Conrad and Shanor, could you briefly share about your experiences returning to your communities, specifically as it relates to employment, and share with us what 2 or 3 challenges that you experienced in obtaining employment?
If Conrad doesn't mind, I'll go first. Coming home, I already knew what field I wanted to get into, and that was the field of information technology. Seeing where the landscape or where the world is headed, you kind of need it to survive nowadays. So that's, I was kind of headed like there just for job security, and CEO gave me the opportunity to actually get trained in that. And it's still relatively new, so I was the second participant of it. But through there, I was trained with, help desk service abilities and capabilities of understanding hardware and software. But after I gained these certifications and got put through these courses, it was kind of troublesome gaining employment afterwards, just because I would do well in interviews, always get to the onboarding process, and then I actually obtained one job for a week. And my job was rescinded because of my background. So it was just really frustrating in the beginning of it all. But CEO stayed with me, and they helped me find this position right now that I'm starting on Monday. So it was just a great help. And I don't know where I would be without them. And I just feel like a lot of people could succeed if they were given this support system that I just so happened to stumble upon.
Yeah, thanks, Shanor. Yeah. And welcome PAC member. Yeah, I spent nearly 30 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections, and inside, and I've met individuals like Danny, and we've happened to cross paths while inside. But I've always been active in wanting to advocate, even in prison, doing programs and having judges and administrators and legislators coming in to do seminars and to empower us as prisoners at that time. I wanted to always be a part of that. So when I came home, it was difficult finding that niche for me coming home to be involved. But I knew I always wanted to serve. I wanted to give back. I wanted to help, but the opportunities were not there. I was told about CEO, talked to my parole agent about it, who wasn't aware of it. And that was shocking to find out that many parole agencies and many people are not familiar with CEO and what they do. So once I found out about it, I informed him, he got educated about it and referred me, got with it, and automatically knew that this is where I wanted to be a part of, because I like what CEO was about. They're about second chances and helping individuals find employment opportunities who face those challenges. And I faced a lot of them after 30 years, especially being convicted of homicide, 2 counts, unfortunately. And that's a hard barrier to overcome many times with interviews. And I've learned that. I went to job interviews. CEO set me up immediately with opportunities. And one particular opportunity, like Shanor, had a job. That actually happened to me 3 times, Shanor. But actually had jobs, went to training. That's money companies have to invest in for your training. And had those issues come in, guess what? HR said, hey, we can't continue with your employment process because your background check came in. So it's disheartening at a lot of times when you get those experiences, but you just keep pushing. So CEO gave me the opportunity to keep pushing. I got a first position was with Team Wellness, one of the mental health facilities that's in Wayne County. Great opportunity, great learning experience, getting certified in mental health. That was something I was involved in while incarcerated, working in a mental health facility. So they recognized your gifts and recognized what you can do. And I was inspired by that. I came home just wanting a job. Like, look, let me work, wherever I can get in at. And CEO came to me with individuals like Nina and Margaret and Sierra and these individuals that was on staff at the time. They said, look, a job you can get, but a career is something that we want you to focus on. And I didn't think about that. I was like, just give me a job. So to have someone see something in you to help push you to the next level, that was inspiring. So I was thankful for the opportunities. And once I moved from Wayne County to Kent County, in Grand Rapids, that's where the real challenges became in, because there's no CEOs there. So I went through the barriers again of employment. I have my own nonprofit, which helps returning citizens find employment. So while trying to find them employment, I'm still trying to find employment. So that became challenging as well. I even worked in a turkey factory, doing what I have to do. But thankfully, these opportunities were able to be presented through CEO again. Being contacted, got with the PAC organization, got with ELP. I'm a graduate, proud graduate. Hello, ELP members. And I'm thankful for what CEO has done, but those have been my barriers.
If I could just add real quick too, comrade, I remember you said another obstacle, besides the stigma of just having a background, also like the digital footprint of it all. So when you would look up a Shanor or a comrade, it'll have our offenses like on the front page, but you don't know us though. And that stops a lot of us from even getting into the door, which is unfortunate.
Absolutely. And thank you both, Conrad and Shanor, for sharing. And congratulations to you, Shanor, for your new job opportunity.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you again. And Dr. Sledge, I understand that Per Scholas also has a referral relationship with the Center for Employment Opportunities to ensure returning citizens have access to training opportunities in the tech space. The question to you is, why are these types of partnerships valuable and important for Per Scholas?
So thank you for that question, Danny. And I'll give you a short answer and I'll give you a full answer. The short answer is so you can have people like Shanor to sit on this panel and to be able to inform and give his testimony and talk about the training that he received in IT. So that's the short answer. The long answer is with respect to a part of our mission, right? One of the things that we do and we take very seriously is the work towards changing the face of what we've currently seen in the IT ecosystem, which is very important in terms of minority individuals, in terms of individuals who may have been overlooked or underlooked and underutilized in that space. And when you talk about having a commitment to social justice, when you talk about having a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, one of the persons that fall into that category oftentimes that doesn't feel like they belong or is not included in opportunities happens to be returning citizens. And so for us, it's mission-based. It's also a pipeline of talent. There are individuals, who are interested in IT, who can do it. They just need the support. They need the opportunity. They need the enroll, the connection. And so what we try to do is provide that for them through our training. And so CEO, in short, for us, is a pipeline of untapped talent, if you will, that we know if they are committed, individuals are committed, and they really want to do the work and learn the skill, then ultimately they will land and begin careers in the IT space, which not just helps from the standpoint of just changing the face of IT, but it also helps to change that individual's economic trajectory, right? So you see that individual being able to make decisions for themselves and their family members that they would not have otherwise been able to do. So there's a steady income. It's career-based. And so those are the types of things that we try to do. And that's one of the reasons why CEO, quite frankly, in the Detroit market, it happens to be one of my preferred partners. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sledge, for sharing that. And definitely would like to thank you, our first group of panelists, for sharing your personal anecdotes and work to frame our conversation moving forward. Our panelists briefly spoke about some of the challenges as it relates to reentry employment. Now we want to provide concrete examples of how these providers and businesses have alleviated these barriers. First, to set the stage for this conversation, Sarah will share some of the more common reasons why employers are worried about hiring individuals with prior justice involvement and the types of services and resources CEO's inclusive hiring team provides. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to join you today. I'm honored to be a part of this important conversation. My team exists because we know that there is a huge amount of change we can accomplish by working directly with employers to change their policies and practices related to hiring people with past convictions. As many of you know, 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record that might keep them from getting their foot in the door, or might have someone start a job and then get their offer rescinded, as many people have voiced in the chat and Conrad and Shanor spoke about just a minute ago. My team focuses on helping employers understand the business case of hiring people with past convictions and also how exactly to implement these programs. I think next slide, we might have some examples. If you could go to the next slide. Perfect. So these are just some common misconceptions that we're working to eliminate in employers. Many employers think that hiring someone with a conviction might mean that you are hiring to a different standard than you normally would. That is absolutely not the case. In data collected by SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, 75% of hiring managers reported that the output quality and the team participation and team environment is just as good, if not better, with people who might be from a justice-involved background. They've also reported there's not as much data as there needs to be in terms of employment, but we can draw very clear parallels to studies that have occurred within the military. And individuals with justice involvement in the military are actually over 30% more likely to be promoted. That evidence shows that the dedication, the drive, the camaraderie, the teamwork, it's even better for people that might have a past conviction. In addition, people tend to be nervous about the state and local regulations that they might have to navigate, or as we'll hear about in a bit, different healthcare or financial services industry regulations. There are actually quite a few ways that this isn't the case, and we'll hear more about that from our policy team shortly, as well as some incentives for companies to do this, including tax credits and things like that. Lastly, some employers worry that customers might have a different experience. This is not the case at all. Customers are satisfied. As we know, people don't even usually know that someone will come from a justice involved background when you're serving a customer. So we work with employers twofold. One, to change their company culture, practices, and policies to make sure that we are reducing stigma, that we are structurally helping them eliminate or reduce the background checks that they're running on individuals, that they reform their hiring matrices to reduce or get rid of any blanket statements barring certain convictions from employment, and that they make sure to really hear individuals out at any that if anything might pop up. We encourage ban the box policies for all across the board. And we also work to educate existing workforces at companies to make sure that this culture change is really coming top to bottom, and that it's not an afterthought, that it's embedded within the company culture. The last part of this is making sure that companies have access to this talent pool, and that participants and applicants have the services that they need to excel within the hiring process and once they're there. So in addition to CEO's usual model, we are developing community partnership coalitions in all of the cities where we're running major projects to make sure that individuals can get access to the supportive services they need and access these hiring opportunities. One specific service I'd like to mention is connection to legal services, that we want to make sure that applicants have support in seeking expungements or record sealing, or like the restrictive industries I mentioned, if you're in financial services, seeking an FDIC waiver or something like that, if it might be applicable to your case. So really trying to focus on how we enact systemic change by working with community partners and employers as one collective unit.
And thank you, Sarah, for sharing this data and information and dispelling some of these myths around employers and the hiring of returning citizens. And again, I'd just like to reiterate to everyone, if at any time you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat box and we will do our best to answer them. At this time, I'd like to hear from Jan Harrington Davis and then Dr. Sledge about your specific industries, healthcare and tech, and your perspectives on two things. One, why there are challenges with second chance hiring in these industries, and two, what have your teams, organizations done to combat these challenges?
Thank you, Danny. I'll go ahead and go first and answer your question. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. As stated earlier, I represent Henry Ford Health System, and I run the operations there of hiring and also workforce diversity. Within that capacity, I could say that we really took a deep interest in hiring returning citizens back in 2015, and that's where we chose to ban the box. And with that, that's taken the question off of the application of if you've ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony, and leaving that question to after an individual is hired. And at that point, we just ask for consent. As stated earlier, in healthcare, we do have some barriers with public acts, whereas certain crimes can't be hired into patient care situations. But that does not keep us from hiring returning citizens. We have strong efforts within the community to actually recruit individuals that are returning citizens into our programs. Along with banning the box, we then took another effort and said, you know what, let's look and see what positions can we lower our qualifications for to increase our applicant pools. So we looked at entry-level positions and we took off having to have a high school diploma or a GED. That really opened up our applicant pools within the Metro Detroit area for people to be able to come in and apply with us. After doing that, we said, you know, so now we have people here, let's bring in a GED program so that we can upskill our employees, because the main goal is to improve economic stability. and for people to not just have a job, but for them to also have a career with us. So we ran that program. And then following that, we started several apprenticeship programs. And with those apprenticeship programs, we invited 50% of our internal population to apply for those, and then also 50% from the community as well. While you go through our apprenticeship programs, and now we have several of them, you're actually paid while you're going to school. And so you go to school, you're paid your hourly rate as if you were working. And then if you complete the program, you have a position. A position is offered to you. So that's just some of our pathway that we have had. I think that it's very important for us to lean into this population because it is an untapped population in this talent war. With us going through the Great Resignation right now and organizations having multiple openings, this is a population that will not only be very grateful for the opportunity, but they are our best workers. So I encourage any employers that are on the line here today to step into this space. And then I also would offer, if you have any questions from an employer perspective, please reach out to me and I can share our experiences with you.
And I just like to double click on everything that you said in terms of practices that that have worked, right? And about this untapped potential, right? I also want to add the fact that in the IT space, for me, I've found that being intentional in terms of which employers I seek and build a relationship with helps me place persons who are graduates of our training program. Obviously, in the Detroit area, you know, we have some pretty sophisticated IT companies and we have some smaller size IT companies. And for me, once I'm able to talk about the success stories from learners who've graduated, once I'm able to talk about how they've added value to other organizations and what they've done in their training, I kind of look for sponsors, right? Because in this work, unfortunately, when you have someone with the background, you need somebody to vouch for them for this second chance, right? And so I'm big on employers coming with sponsorships, right? Or being willing to sponsor individuals who they feel will add value to their organizations. For the most part, the ban in the box, the political commitment to this being a bipartisan effort, and we're all in support of that. Those things for me sit in the parking lot. But in terms of people actually investing in this work and saying it's something that they really want to do and they're committed, it looks differently when they show up and they sponsor and they create opportunities for individuals, and not just opportunities in the lowest hierarchy of the organization. I'm really, really big on that, right? So the same opportunities that they would for individuals to have a lifestyle and an economic pathway, not just relegated to a subsidiary area of the organization of the company. That's really big for me. And so I guess in short, or in summary, being able to build those relationships one employer at a time, being able to offer employers a chance to sponsor individuals who want to work for them, to vouch for them, if you will, are all ways that we try to increase our employer index, if you will, for opportunities for persons in the IT space.
And can I just add another thought to this as well? In the mode of hiring returning citizens, it doesn't just stop with hiring. If you're very intentional in this space, you have to provide pathways of success during their entire employment. So what does that look like? They may have barriers to transportation. They may have barriers to childcare. All of those things can couple in with an organization being aware of what one may have to show up to work every day. So being intentional is knowing that and then providing resources to help people in that space as they're getting themselves together financially and situated back into life. So those are also resources that one must look at if you're looking at putting this type of program together.
Yes, and thank you, Jan. Thank you, Dr. Sledge, for your work and for sharing your insights. And just a quick follow-up question, which of course you've already spoken to, but if you would care to elaborate a little further, how are your teams making sure that someone's prior justice involvement is not a barrier to them being successful in the workforce?
So
Well,
I can,
oh, go ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead, Jan.
Okay. For us, your criminal history is totally confidential within human resources. We don't share that information with our hiring leaders. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One, that is to mitigate any type of bias, either conscious or unconscious, that may come knowing that they have a criminal history. Two, we don't want that to work against them in any form or fashion. So it's not even something that we track. Like I can't give you numbers to say how many people we've hired this year with a criminal history, because we don't want that to follow them through their employment relationship with us. So that's how we do it, and it does work. And JR, you could go ahead now.
Yeah, pretty much similar in terms of knowledge of the offense. My team has no knowledge of the offense with the exception of myself and my employment coach. And so what that does is the classroom teacher, the other persons who provide support, they're blind to everything about the individual besides their ability to show up to class and of course do the work and participate in the training. For my employment coach, they have a responsibility, because usually there may be one or two in a particular cohort, to take that individual under their wings, to get, and again, it's a form of sponsorship, right? To make sure that they are using employers who have already established a relationship with us and a commitment to hire returning citizens. So that's what we do there at Pascolas.
Yes, and thank you again, Jan and Dr. Sledge. Moving to Kaiser, I understand that CSW has not only thought about, but implemented their own internal hiring best practices. Could you share more about those internal practices and why the company has made these changes?
Sure. Thanks again for having me today. Just wanted to know, although we work nationally, we're headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and so I'm happy to connect and talk with you on something more locally. So I was just at a national meeting in DC over the last several days, got back in last night, and workforce leaders across the country. And there was a presentation by the executive VP of research for the Atlanta Fed. And he shared some recent data from March. I just wanted to kind of put this into perspective to kind of give us some context about the feelings that we're having. And Jan mentioned the Great Resignation also, which feeds into this drop in the current labor force participation rate. And so the participation rate was 64% in 2011, and it took a dive in 2019 to 60.4%, and currently hasn't recovered. It's at 62.4%. So why is this happening? We've got boomers retiring. Immigration has drastically been cut, some could say by 75%. Millennials and Xers are questioning entering the job force and wanting more than wage to help them make decisions. So this means that this delay and this feeling that we have about service, it's not going away really quickly unless we do something about it that's very specific and intentional. And so it's about tapping into these talent pools that you guys are talking about today. And again, congrats to Shanor. Under new position, the company who hired you is smart, and this needs to be happening more. You're a younger worker. It's a service that's needed, and it's in a high growth occupation. So more employers need to understand this data and really look at how are we going to overcome this lack of participation in the employment rate if we don't really look at and stop ignoring, not just untapping, but ignoring and rejecting candidates that could be really good for companies. So I wanted to say in 2019, we took a more intentional and forward-looking approach to our inclusive hiring practices. And we started by looking internally and hired a DEI consultant which really looked at our cultural change and development. We looked at our changing our mission, our vision, our values, and really naming things, not using blanket terms, but naming race. So no more code words. We talk about upward mobility, and we pulled out race that was kind of intertwined into another value and made it its own value. We also really looked at how do we measure and think about the work that we enter into to make sure that racial equity and inclusion has a central focus in that work. And we track that with our key performance indicators, or our KPIs. We've also created a hiring process in which we blind our applications. I'm the only one that really sees who comes in. I give a number associated with that person. And then actually just, we do location, because again, we work nationally thinking about where we want people located, but there are no degree requirements on our applications as well. And the work is really centered around a profiling piece that a team leads that looks at competencies. It's skills and competencies over credentials. So there is not a degree requirement on the application. There is not a question about background. If that information wants to be volunteered, it can, but we don't look in that. We also have put salary range on the job description, which promotes wage equity. And we see that our peers are looking at us and they're starting to follow. So I think a big part of this is how you can influence the people that you work with and in your space is going to be critical to the work that you do. And we've even developed some tools. One is called a comp exchange, which looks at how do we profile jobs to ensure that what we're requiring and asking for, is it really needed? Are the competencies and skills, do they match what's needed in the job? And can somebody demonstrate that versus having requirements that might be outdated? So those are the things we're working with states such as Alabama to really unpack and align competencies found in high demand occupations to the credentials that are out there, so that there's a better alignment and that people are able to not dissuaded from occupations and really have a better and a fair chance at entering into those fields. And I'll talk more about some of the policy changes and things like that a little later on.
Thank you, Kaiser, again, for your work and for sharing your experiences and insights in this field. Again, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please utilize the chat box. I am aware that some questions have been asked and answered. But again, if you have any questions for our first two segments of this panel conversation, the first panel discussed the problems and challenges around barriers for employment opportunities for formerly incarcerated people. The second portion of the panel discussed practice level solutions, and we will now be moving into our third panel portion, which will discuss policy level solutions.
Danny, before we jump into that third section, there is a question in the chat that Sarah was answering a little bit, but Sarah, if you would like to just provide additional details around transportation and how that's sometimes a barrier.
Sure, absolutely. And Eliana, thank you for your question. This is actually a very specific situation that I've run into multiple times where employers say, oh, I didn't realize it was that hard for people to get a license, that it's fines and fees are that big of a barrier. Or that they say, oh, the bus route doesn't run here, but we're close enough. No, that doesn't work. So we have found that employers are pretty receptive to saying, okay, what about a van service that maybe we can have alternating who is the person running it, or make sure that it aligns with regular shifts to make sure that people are on board. We found that it helps with attendance, it helps with communication, and it's a benefit that is helpful for folks across the board, not even just people who might have these barriers related to a prior conviction. One of the other reasons that we really encourage employers to make that a broader benefit is that we don't want a situation in which this van shows up and everyone says, oh, that's the crew that are returning citizens. That we want to make sure that people feel folded into whatever standard employer base is there, and that we're not isolating anyone. And also that these are barriers that other employees face too. and that they might have pushed under the rug or found something to temporarily help them, but that these are the kind of fixes that need to be included in a standard benefits package. So that's how we've been pitching it to other companies, that it really is a core benefit that will expand those who can take on roles at the company. Eliana, I hope that helped answer.
Yeah, thank you for asking these questions and giving our panelists an opportunity to address them. Was that the only question that needed to be addressed, Leah?
I think so. There's one in the chat that maybe Conrad or Chinor can answer, but this is from Charles Grasso, a current advocacy fellow at CEO, and he asked, is there a pathway for me to continue advocating my experience of 40 years of incarceration and why reentry from prison is a social justice issue in need of expansion? Danny, you might also be able to share additional insight on this front, especially in Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are several efforts and ways that you can get involved and continue to share your experience. I definitely will put my email address into the chat box. You can definitely reach out to me and connect, and we can definitely talk more about this. Not a problem at all. And just for the sake of course, getting through the remainder of our panelists and our webinar, just moving forward in our panel discussion, moving into our policy level solutions. Of course, this final piece of today's webinar is to begin thinking through policy and legislative changes and best practices for second chance hiring. This first question that I will ask to open up this space is for all panelists, but maybe we can start with Kaisha and Jan. What types of policy changes are your teams advocating for economically disadvantaged groups, such as returning citizens, have greater access to sustainable employment?
Sure. Happy to dive into that. I know some folks you ask, are DEI policies enough? And I would just say starting there, it is a start, but there is a difference between DEI and REI. As we know, for DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then there's racial equity and inclusion. We know that incarceration disproportionately affects Black and Brown people. And we know that Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at nearly 5 times the rate of whites and Latinx people at 1.3. And in 12 states, including Michigan, more than half of the prison population is Black. So, and this is from the Sentencing Project's 2021 report. And again, for several reasons, based on structural disadvantages, over policing, pretrial detention, and a lot of other factors that I won't go into because of time. But by naming race, it's an intentional decision and policy choice, I think, that we need to look at first, and not just saying it's an inclusive issue, let's name race. But I think policy could look at some priority issues, such as a continuum of supportive services that was mentioned earlier, looking at safe and stable housing, access to medical care, building and mending family and community bonds, transportation, of course, is key, along with that valid driver's license, pre-employment services and training, again, aligning skills and even doing some of that while incarcerated. The MDLC currently is providing vocational training in a dozen trades, and they're launching an apprenticeship program with the U.S. Department of Labor while folks are incarcerated, and that's important. And of course, those post-employment training opportunities. But building those employer partnerships and targeting those employers who are smart, like the ones that hired Chinor, and they need to know about that they have to have a sustainable mindset to be here for the next 20 years. They have to reevaluate the requirements, the barriers to entry, and in a broader landscape, when it comes to just tapping into broader talent, what it means to be professional and qualified. That question needs to be reevaluated. And so I think those are a couple of policy things. We're actually partnering and launching an initiative with a group of Michigan funders to look at that, look at the landscape and analyze and assess workforce employment programs for justice-involved residents, particularly in Michigan, highlighting some promising practices, looking at gaps in workforce programming, and bringing the voice of participants, which I think is something that's not done a lot in policy. We talk to people and for people, but not with people and having them involved, and they'll be involved in the design of this initiative and focus groups and feedback. And also we're looking to have an intern actually be a partner alongside us as we do this work. So a couple of quick policy pieces.
And I could say ditto to all of that with Kaisha as well. In addition to that, at Henry Ford Health, and last year, we rolled out our strategy in this space, and it's diversity, equity, inclusion. And now we added a component which is called justice. And that justice piece is a separate pillar where we're really looking at institutional racism, institutional discrimination, policies that are in place, whereas if a person is racist or not, it still may have racist outcomes. And really looking at those particular places within the organization and reducing those barriers. In addition to that, we also have a government affairs department that really works with us, with our state and federal government, to reduce barriers under the public acts that prohibit us to hire those with criminal convictions in the patient care setting, and looking to expand that as well. So there's work being done on many, many facets within our organization. Kaisha mentioned that, having policies or a strategy within your organization, is that enough? No, it isn't enough. You have to have support from the top. And you have to have a belief system, whereas you can be intentional in this space to helping people that have barriers. And like she said, we do find that most of the people that have barriers are Black and brown people. So having that stance on being an anti-racist organization is helpful as well.
Thank you, Kaisha and Jan, for sharing that. And a quick follow-up question, and of course, all of the panelists can chime in. And the question is, what are your opinions about diversity, equity, and inclusion policies? Are they effective in increasing the hire of people with backgrounds?
I'll jump in and take that. I think that they are effective as long as they are not performative, right? And when I say performative, meaning that they've jumped on the bandwagon, we know what happened with George Floyd, et cetera, et cetera. And so not everybody is touting their DEI, pins, if you will. So if it's performative, absolutely short answer, no. But if it's intentional with respect to being able to be measured, being able to be quantified in terms of what individuals are doing to really cover those aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I argue that certainly returning citizens falls into that piece, then I would say yes. I think that coupled with a response to your previous question, just to add on that, I think that it's highly politicized too. And one of the things that we have to do a better job at is holding our politicians accountable for this work as well. Many of them will sign up at election time saying they're all for this, but have they really allocated staff positions to do this work, right? When you see someone, they may have a person on their staff. I'm talking about state reps. I'm talking about state representative as well as national representatives in the House. It's so they have dedicated staff and resources on their teams who are really working towards doing this work, right? Do they have line items to support what we're talking about in terms of barrier removal? Or are we just looking at it from an aggregate approach, right? Meaning across the country. Listening to the stats that Sister Fraser just raised and shared with us, you know, there's a lot of work that we could do locally that we have to do when we talk about how we're impacted by individuals with backgrounds. And so what do our politicians do? How can we hold them accountable? How can we force those legislative changes that Janice talked about in terms of the public acts that work against what it is that those of us great people on this call are attempting to do? And I think that's a huge portion of the work as well.
Yeah, if I could piggyback off of what Dr. Sledge was saying, absolutely, when it's non-performative, I believe it's super effective. I also like to say all the time that in different panels I've been in before, that sort of the crime rate that you see in these urban and inner city communities is directly connected to like the employment rate. So if individuals are having resources and having opportunities, who's to say they're doing these acts? I know for me, if I was introduced to the field of IT and I was told I could start off at 60,000 a year or even 30,000 a year, and I was told that while I was in high school, who's to say I even like get in trouble and has to go to MDOC? So I just think it's like super important. And then once you give these people the opportunity, the community thrives. Like if I'm able to provide for my family, I can provide for my nephews or their friends. And I just feel like all in all, it's a win-win situation, just giving returning citizens this opportunity. Yeah, super passionate about this.
If I can piggyback off Shanor and what the doctor just spoke about, I think the work environment should be reflective of our society. And I had a great example. I mentioned the turkey factory that I was a part of in Kent County. But one thing about the turkey factory with that company, they were the best example, and they were even given, praise for that, of being inclusive and hiring all types. And they even had different speakers for individuals with different languages barriers. So they made sure they covered everybody. We have a population of 2.2 million in incarceration in this country. These individuals will be let out, the majority. So this is part of our population. This is part of our society. It's part of our culture. The LGBTQ communities, they are part of our culture. They're inclusive in our workforces. And this is what makes a great work environment, when you learn to bring all these type of individuals together to work collectively for a common goal. So I think that should be one of the main focuses with employers, is being more inclusive with what is reflective of what our society is about today. I think that's important.
Absolutely. And thank you all for chiming in. And of course, I do see a couple of questions in the chat box, but if the remaining panelists would like to also chime in, the floor is yours.
Can I just mention again, just thinking about state policy in particular, there's nearly 9,000 Michiganders going to be released in parole, I guess about a year ago. And just want to reiterate that valid driver's license is critical. Michigan State Identification Pilot Program is happening. It provides the state ID when a parolee re-enters in the community. Again, want to see how that can be expanded and make sure that people are aware of that. Staying current on hiring eligibility and making sure employers understand the things that Sarah mentioned earlier as well about statutes and things that could be old and not off the books, and people are still trying to enforce those. Diverting people with behavioral health needs, and how can we really center and look in on that away from the justice system, and what can be done there for folks who are there, but after they get out, what supports are there for folks with mental health needs? And then automating the process of Medicaid, Medicare benefits for returning citizens, again, I think is an important piece. So just want to mention a couple of those things, particular to Michigan.
Thank you, Kaiser. And just to utilize these last few minutes, we definitely want to address some of the questions that have been put in the chat box. This question comes from Desiree Simmons, and the question is, how does a company become a sponsor for an employee that has been formerly incarcerated. And she has a couple of follow-ups, but I will allow the panel to address that first question.
I guess I'll jump in, and I'm a training org, but I work with tons and tons of employers. And I think the terms of how to become, of course, is leadership's willingness to say yes. I think it's just that simple. If leaders commit and they say yes, and then you take it from there, and you could have a shared agreement. You can work out an MOU, and you can make it informal, right? In terms of as simple as a gentleman's handshake. So there are no barriers to being able to sponsor and really want to hire persons who have past offenses.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. It's different than immigration, in which you need an official sponsor. I think one of the supportive services we haven't mentioned yet is structured mentorship once someone is employed. And in many cases, this could be the one person at the company that does know that you might have a conviction. Or if companies have affinity groups that you elect into, it could be through that type of system. There doesn't need to be a way specifically that a company formally sponsors someone, but setting up a structured mentorship program or a way to help someone walk through the experience, especially from someone who's been there before, can be really powerful.
Thank you, Dr. Sledge and Sarah. And she has two follow-up questions, which are, how can the community encourage employers to become sponsors, and what kinds of language should we look for?
I can chime in there again. This is probably most in line with what I do. I would say very clear commitments. We've all seen a lot of companies come out with somewhat vague racial justice statements that don't really have a lot of commitments, accountability built in there. And so when you see companies making concrete financial investments, holding themselves to numerical goals for increasing workforce diversity within a certain amount of time, creating new teams, adding in those benefits that we've seen, when you see companies doing more than just a statement, that's very helpful. We also encourage companies to be as transparent as they can in just the job description. So this could be a whole other conversation, but how to make job descriptions more equitable and focusing on skills rather than accolades or degrees, something like that. And I know Perscolis does a lot of work in this area, but making sure that that's part of the process as well, and making sure that these employers have thought through the hiring process to all the way to retention and advancement.
Yeah, and to add on to Sarah's point, if companies could just kind of make a commitment to, I guess, engaging with that said community. Like a lot of jobs that I've been offered or interviews I go through that are based in Detroit, a lot of Detroiters don't have the opportunity to even interview for these jobs, whether they don't have the education for it or whether they just didn't have access to even fill out the application. So if like a company is really embedded or serious about this cause, I believe like probably going to these DPS schools, going to these schools or going to after school programs, interacting with the youth or even returning citizens. We're just people inside the community. So your company could reflect actually where you work at, which I think it should always be that way.
And just to tag on to that, I think a little practical, and I hope I'm not minimizing the work, but it's as simple as using your phones and your emails, right? Send the email to somebody in HR. If you notice, if you look at the company's website, if they have a chief diversity officer, if they have someone who's heading up some type of community engagement, send them an email and just ask, do they hire returning citizens, or what's their work, what's their involvement, right? As a community, we're quick to complain and put somebody on blast on social media. So maybe flipping that and looking at companies, organizations who do this work and shouting them out, right? One of the things that I'm convinced of is that success breeds success, right? And people are more likely to replicate a behavior that you praise them for. So let's begin to uplift companies who are already doing this work. And at the same time, companies and organizations who are not doing this work, let's figure out a way that we can have some one-to-one contacts with them so that they can begin to at least consider and raise the awareness around the importance of this work.
Absolutely. And thank you all for your comments. Thank you all for your excellent questions. And while this has been a great and very informative conversation, the fact that we're even having this conversation means that barriers still exist for formerly incarcerated people to obtain employment, but that there are efforts in play to address these concerns. And remember, I said earlier that I was going to tell you how you can join MI-CEMI and support our efforts. Well, here's how. You can join MI-CEMI by signing on to our resolution. Signing on to our resolution just means that you are in support of MI-CEMI's efforts and will allow you to receive a subscription to our newsletter and stay up to date on everything MI-CEMI. You can also follow MI-CEMI on our Facebook, on our Instagram, on our Twitter. We also have a YouTube page, and we will also be adding this webinar to our YouTube page for people to be able to view it. Again, I'd like to thank the Center for Employment Opportunities, and you can also assist them by completing their follow-up survey, which will be sent out at the conclusion of this webinar. Again, thank you, CEO. Thank you for your hard work and your efforts. A special thanks goes out to all of our panelists. And of course, thank you for joining us and attending today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day. Peace and love.
See you, everybody.